Everyone, good evening. I think the last time I was here it was really snowy but the sun was shining because I remember we couldn't see that. We couldn't see the screen. So when I was talking to some colleagues at work today, they said, don't you have a presentation this week? And I said, yeah, I have one in Warren. And they said, what's it about? And I said, oh, you know, the challenges of living in a small town. And they're like, isn't that like everywhere? Like, you know, isn't like even Washington, D.C. and New York City a small town? And it's like, well, that's true. It is. But I do think the challenges are somewhat a little more significant in a small town versus a small town, big city. Because having lived in New York, you know, there are neighborhoods in New York that some people don't leave for years. And I remember talking to people who said, you know, I haven't been past 42nd Street in, I don't know, probably 15 years, you know. And sort of like, well, when you're in the village, you know, that's what you'll do. So I just sort of think that one of the interesting things about small towns is everything that they have to offer, but also some of the challenges. So I'm going to start by doing a little more self-disclosure than usual, two funny stories. One was I was on vacation and I got a text from my sister-in-law saying it was on the news today that Kevin Gallagher was arraigned in Burlington Superior Court on charges of child pornography. And so we're hoping it's not you, you know. And so I got back from vacation and called my sister-in-law, and she said it was so funny because she said my husband was watching the news, and he goes, oh my God, come here, quick, quick, quick. So she's like, I'm watching it with him, and he says, do you think that's our Kevin? And she's like, no. And he said, well, he's in Mexico, like maybe he had to go. And she said he was arraigned today, which means he would have had to show up. And it's sort of like, oh, right, I forgot that part. And they don't even live in Chittenden County. They live in the southern part of the state. So when I came back, I was sort of thinking like, well, you know, there aren't a lot of Kevin Gallaghers, and maybe I should be worried for some reason. I'm not quite sure why, but maybe I should. And then I got busy and didn't even think anything about it. And so about 2 weeks later, I get a call from another therapist who I know in town, who I hadn't seen or talked to in months. And she said, how are you, Kevin? And I'm like, I'm good, how are you? And she's like, I'm good. She's like, you know, so things are going really well. And I'm like, yeah, I just got back from vacation. It's March, I'm brown, you know, I'm happy right now. And she's like, so everything's good. I'm like, everything's good? Yeah. She's like, no legal problems? And I'm like, no legal problems. I'm like, oh, the Kevin Gallagher. I'm like, I'm not that Kevin Gallagher. And she said, well, I kind of feel like I have to tell you that sort of the scuttlebutt in the therapist community is that it said it was a 52-year-old psychotherapist in Burlington, which would be me. And I said, really? And she said, and I felt pretty sure it probably wasn't you, but then I thought, I don't want to start another rumor, sort of saying it's not you, and then you're on the cover of the Burlington Free Press, you know, someday, and then I look like I was, you know, covering for you or something. So then I got nervous, like all over again, like thinking, well, should I do something about this? I said, well, just tell people that, you know, I'm not that Kevin Gallagher. So I thought, maybe I should be asking my clients if they've heard or read anything, because I wasn't here when that news broke. And so I'm telling all my clients, and they're all like, no, I didn't hear that. Oh my God, is it you? You know, and it's like, no. And then they're like, oh, that must be terrible. Like, what are you going to do about it? And I sort of felt like, you know, with each hour, I'm getting like more and more anxious that I should just, so I thought, I'm not telling anybody else now. And so I ended up going on my professional association, the Vermont Mental Health Counselors Association website, and doing a listserv, you know, with the subject, you know, I'm not that Kevin Gallagher. And if you're at a conference or a cocktail party or something and people are talking about me going to jail, you can say, he's not that Kevin Gallagher. But, you know, sort of like when I first moved to Burlington, I was the only Kevin Gallagher. Now there are 6 of us. I've had a car accident with one of them, which the cop thought was very interesting that we were both Kevin P. Gallagher and we both had Allstate insurance. And we didn't know each other. And there's another one who I used to get all his charges at the video store because I'd say I'm not that Kevin Gallagher, I'm the other one. But that's just one person's name. Like, that's one person's name of somebody who's not even doing anything, you know. And so, you know, and Burlington's bigger than Warren or Waitsfield or Moortown. But not too big to talk, you know, not too big to talk. The other story is my father has 9 wives. He didn't believe in really marrying or being intimate in a relationship unless he was married. So I think he probably would have had what we'd call hookups, but instead he had wives instead. You know, and sort of like, you know, to sort of like have a father, you know, who's a bit of a scoundrel. You know, he borrowed money from people, never paid them back, married people, never supported the children from those relationships, sort of like, you know, and everyone knows that's your story, you know, in your town. Everyone knows that's your story. So I'm hoping that tonight we can talk a little bit about what it means to live in a town, what it means to have a story, because we all have stories, and then what do we do with our story? And is being really private and closed better than being open? You know, I think it's really, it's hard to know, and I think it also varies from person to person, sort of what they might expect. So we should hopefully have a little fun with the topic too. All right, so what makes a town and what makes a community a community? I mean, there are lots of towns that have no community feel. After Irene, it was really interesting to sort of hear news pieces on VPR about sort of like how we never really came together as a town and people didn't really talk to each other very much. But after Irene, we were all there for each other, and now we check in on people, and you know that the old lady down the street doesn't really walk very well. You know, from Irene, you know that. So now you'll sort of like check in on her when it's icy and sort of say, you shouldn't really go out today. Do you need anything at the store? So, you know, what makes a community versus just a town? Because a town is a geographical reference, not necessarily a reference to how its citizens coalesce with each other. And I think Vermont's like just a perfect example of towns. So, you know, is a community based or a town based on population? It doesn't matter how big or how small a place is in terms of supportive. I've not been to Wyoming, you know, but I hear that it's not unusual to have your closest neighbor, you know, 18, 30 miles away on another ranch, you know, and so I'm thinking like, well, what's their sense of what community means or what the town is? Proximity. There are some towns where everyone lives on top of each other, like people do in cities, and then there's towns where people are really spread out all over the place, you know. And so are there advantages and disadvantages to how we cluster in terms of our closeness to each other? Knowledge. How much do we know about each other? You know, every town would be foolish to not have its share of gossips in town, and you know, and we all, I'll put myself in that category, we all have moved around information that really had no purpose but to move it around. And so some people possess more knowledge: the bank teller, the town clerk, the local doctor. You know, sort of the local doctor you found out you had herpes from. You know, and sort of wonder, I wonder how many people will know that. Well, don't worry, we won't tell anybody. Well, the diagnosis goes to the nurse, the nurse charts it, the billing receptionist person builds the code. You know, so many people know things. So knowledge can really make a difference between just a town and a community. Understanding. I never connect knowledge with understanding. I think Congress would be a really great example of that right now. There's a lot of knowledge. I don't really understand what they're doing at all. I can't believe they're getting paid and that we're paying them. So it's sort of like, what's my understanding of what it means to live in this community? And there you get sort of a lot of striation between sort of people who have lived in communities for generations and generations and people who popped in 2 years ago and tore down the little house and built some giant thing with an attached garage, and now we sort of never see them. And sort of like, so who are they? So what do we understand about the people in our community? And then relationship. And what kind of relationships do we have? I know many a school teacher in a small town who purposely live in other towns. Just because they say it's just too hard to go to the grocery store, to go out for pizza, to go to the movies without kids wanting to talk to you, or parents wanting to talk to you, or parents being mad at you because you disciplined their kid. Or, I don't really want to, be out at a bar having a couple of beers with some friends and sort of have, some family worried that, their teacher, has a drinking problem. And so I like to live 2 or 3 towns away from where I teach. Conversely, some people sort of feel like the beauty of teaching and living in the same community is that I am totally embedded. I know my neighbors, I know all the kids, I know the kids' parents. I can be so much more effective in the classroom by having that kind of knowledge. So again, it's very different how we approach this whole idea of small town living. But it's got quite a bucolic reputation. That's sort of like, one of the nice things I like about Vermont in that it's so cold, so long, is that if it were like this last 6 weeks, we would probably have 6 million people living in Vermont, and it'd be very crowded. But it's this kind of weather that makes no one really interested, or what's coming, no one really interested. Even the skiers sort of tire. There's some years the skiing is really good, but it's 20 below the whole time, so you can't really ski. So we have, thank you, Cindy. The idea of a town is very different than living in a town. Have you folks here, have you always lived in smaller places? No. Is this the smallest place you've lived? Yeah. No. Is this the smallest you'll go? I remember saying that when I moved to Burlington. It's like, okay, I can never get smaller than this. Like, something terrible will happen to me if I go smaller than this. Wyoming. Yeah. I haven't even visited. That's how much. I don't think I want that much space. I like crowds. Yeah, I like crowds. Or something. I think I saw a horror film in high school where, of course, it's some babysitter that's being, chased around with someone with a knife. And, he says to her, scream all you want. No one will ever hear you. And I thought, good reason to never live in the country. Like, that is the only reason I need. I will never live where someone could pull that line. So now I live in a condo where I just would bang on the wall and yell, Steve, the murderer's here. Yeah.
Oh no, it's Kevin Gallagher.
It's Kevin Gallagher, not the other one, the other Kevin Gallagher, All right. So this is Mary Pfeiffer. Some of you might know some of her books. She wrote Reviving Ophelia, which is about young girls and eating disorders, pre-adolescent and adolescent girls. It was very interesting. Years after she wrote that book, I heard her speaking at Killington. And someone said, is she still as anxious about the state of young women? And she said, well, when I wrote that book, my daughter was a teenager, and I was very concerned about these teenage girls and how they were managing body image and food and diets. And she said, it caused me to be so alarmed I wrote this book. But now my daughter's 25. She's really kind of sane. She eats, and she's sort of normal. So I think girls are doing better now. She said, now I'm on to something else that I'm worried about. So this particular book, The Shelter of Each Other, the small part says, simple solutions for survival in this family-unfriendly culture, eye-opening, heart-wrenching, and uplifting. She's a great writer. She's from Lincoln, Nebraska. One story she likes to tell is when she got really famous, she and her husband bought a bigger house in Lincoln. She had 2 kids, a boy and a girl. And a year or so after they were living in the house, she asked the kids one night, do you like living in the big house? And they said no, that we can't hear you talking anymore. And she said there was something they found comforting in our really small house before, that they would hear us talking downstairs, but now everyone's got their own room and their own bathroom. And so she's small town all the time. She refused to go on book tours. Her publisher was like so irritated with her, and she's like, well, I have this women's group I do every Tuesday morning, coffee and breakfast, and like if you can schedule it around that, but I can't be gone all the time. I have a job and I have friends and a family. And they just thought this was absurd. So you might like any of her books. She's a brilliant writer, and she speaks very plainly about complex things. But in this movie, in this book, The Shelter of Each Other, she was sort of thinking about her aging mother and trying to think about the difference between her mother's generation and her own generation. And she decided to do some research on what are the biggest changes from then to now. And she was thinking technology, transportation, and psychology. She said, we just know so much more. And she's like, and plus I'm a psychologist, and I'm thinking, my mother still doesn't even know what I am. And so these were the things that she was looking for. And she said the thing that stood out most for her in her research was that in the 70s, houses stopped building or using front porches, and we moved to decks and patios. And everyone moved to the back of the house. And that was not a coincidence, probably, that that's when the proliferation of television occurred during that same time. Because for those of you who are like my age, you know, there used to just sometimes be nothing on TV. Not like there's nothing now. There used to be like nothing, snow. And you would watch the snow waiting for the next show to start. And then it would go off at night with the Star-Spangled Banner and a flag waving. And then it would go to, you know, and so, you know, she noticed that as people moved to the front of the houses, and notice when you're out of here, because there's a lot of porches here, but notice when you're in other places how simple people's front doors are, mostly just doors, versus big porches, sometimes all the way around. But she noticed that people stayed very interested in wanting to know what's going on, but started watching TV to do that. You know, so how many people know, how many people know more about Oprah and Stedman's love life than they do the woman who lives across the street? But you used to know what was going on with the woman across the street. Because you'd sit out there, and then you'd go in the house, and you'd sort of say, what's going on at Mabel's? She's got more traffic this week? Is she sick? Or is she up to something? I don't know. So then they would ask. And I don't necessarily think that kind of community is necessarily bad. Because there was a way that people used to parent each other's kids. I can think of being at the movies and fooling around, and I'd get like some hit from behind and be some parent saying, sit down, stop talking, and I'd say, sorry, and you sneak down, you look at your friends, and you're like, oh my God, now kids get up and say, I'm calling DCF and I'm going to report you, and they call 911, and movie stopped, and a little too sophisticated. But I'd get yelled at for riding my bike in neighborhoods that I don't belong. You get yelled at for being in someone's yard. They say, what are you doing in the yard? Well, my friend lives here. Well, they're not home right now. Go. And people paid attention. That you knew sort of like who was not in this neighborhood, who was not from this neighborhood. And we've lost a lot of that. And so I think some of the benefits of community is the, it takes a village idea that, lots of eyes and ears. I met this kid once. He had 2 lesbian moms who divorced and remarried, so he had 4 lesbian moms. I said to him, that's a lot of estrogen for a teenager. And he said, yes, it's a lot. And he said, and they always tell me, you'll never be able to do anything wrong because every lesbian in this town is watching you, like your mother. And so I said, has it worked? And he goes, yeah, I don't really get in much trouble. And I sort of thought, and I bet those 4 mothers meant it. Yeah, I bet when their friends say, how's he doing? And sort of like, oh, you keep an eye on him. If you see him and he's up to something, you tell him, and then you tell me. Is that good or that bad? I don't know. It probably could be abused on some level. But I also sort of think there's something containing in a useful and protective way when people can be looking out for each other and not necessarily looking out to do anything harmful to each other. So porches. Do people sit on their porches here? I don't have one. I have a deck. Yeah. Do you have a porch? How many porches? Yes. And does it get used like they used to get used? You know, do you sit out like we used to in the old days and like write down license plate numbers as like an activity? You know, or how many different states drove by your house, you know, back when like you might have 5 cars come down your street in a whole day. I have a friend who grew up on a dirt road that only had one other house past his house, and they had 6 kids at that house. And he said in the summer, he and his brother and sister used to set up a lemonade stand. I'm like, okay, I could cry. Like a lemonade stand on a dirt road that no one lives on. Like, and you fell for this? Like your mother was brilliant to get rid of you. He said, well, we'd pour gasoline on the road and do Evel Knievel with our bikes through the fire while we were waiting for cars. But he's like, if the family down the road didn't come home while we had it out, you know, we didn't make any money that day. But if they did, they'd stop and everyone would get a cup and we'd make 60 cents. You know, so I don't know. Some parts of small towns, I don't know. I would have been a little frustrated there. All right. So big city stressors and small town challenges. We do have the exact same stressors as the big cities, except we don't necessarily have transit strikes. But we have everything else. We have transit, right. It's on permanent strike. Yes, right. And often the places that have transit strikes are relying on transit because they think having a car would be the dumbest idea possible. Not to mention what you pay for a parking space in San Francisco or New York. So, but it's pretty much the same struggles. And these are the kind of struggles that get talked about in towns. People's health. People watch people's health. People watch people's health everywhere. Sex. Who's having it, who's not having it, when they're having it, how they're having it. We're very interested in other people's sex lives. The evidence is just looking at teenagers and how interested they are in showing their junk to everybody else. As though everyone is that interested. But, you know, they are. They are. We do have this kind of thing with the taboo. And so whatever's going on in a community around sex, I sort of put this, the slut and the player. You know, some girls get reputations for being a little slutty or skanky. As my colleague, like she said, I think we got to bring skank back. It was such a good word. And then boys are like players or studs. The gender bias is unbelievable. But sort of like, but you know, these are hard for families in towns. Some of these girls who have reputations of putting out really don't put out that much. But you know, once you have the reputation, then you live with the reputation. Some of these boys are not as amazing as they think they are. If you've ever seen the movie Easy A with Emma Stone, a really, really great movie. It's sort of a loose translation of The Scarlet Letter. But Emma Stone gets a reputation in school, and it's very hard to change. But sort of like, you know, this becomes incredibly difficult for families to manage, especially because sometimes people will take it upon themselves to confront a mother or a father and make a comment about their son or their daughter at a time when you're not really feeling like talking, nor does it sound like parenting. It sounds more like judgment and criticism. Money and finances. People moved from the bigger house to now a smaller house. People are not having a leased car every 2 years. Now they're, you know, driving a 1994 Toyota. And so we start wondering about sort of, what's going on relative to the family finances. Employment. We tend to know in towns who's been hired and who's been fired for both reasons. And we also tend to know who's not getting a job because they seem to be around a lot. And so it's like, oh, I saw Joe at the store. What time was it? 2 o'clock. Guess he's not working yet. We watch each other like hawks. We watch each other like hawks. Kids, very stressful. Very, very stressful. There's a lot of lying that goes on around kids, I have noticed. Parents have increasingly limited how much they want to tell other parents what's going on with their kids. I don't know if it's shame, embarrassment, don't want to give people something to talk about. But when I was little, you could pretty much count on when a group of parents were together, they would complain about their children to each other. And they would say who's been up to what and who's been getting A's and who got suspended. And you just talked about your kids because you had them and you were all doing the same thing. But now I notice that parents, when I say to parents, sort of like, well, it sounds like you're having a really hard time with your daughter. Have you talked to other parents? And they're like, oh no, I would never talk to anybody. I'm like, why? I mean, how about parents that have daughters your age? And it's sort of like, yeah, just really wouldn't be comfortable. And it's like, why? And sort of like, well, because they would think differently about her. They would think differently about me. They would think we're not really good parents. And it's like, because only bad parents have kids that have troubles? I think good parents do too. And actually, there's some bad parents that actually have pretty good kids too. And I don't know if it's a slam dunk either way. But there's a real hesitancy. I mean, I have gone to the mat practically on the floor with some parents that are really, really stressed with their son or daughter's out of control behavior. And I sort of suggest things like, what if we had a meeting of your relatives, teachers, coaches, neighbors, people who have known your son or daughter for a long time, and sort of think like, what would a collective response to this? And I said, if for anything, so that you two would have support during this very difficult time. We could never do something like that. It would be so humiliating. And so I said to my mother, I'm like, Mom, why weren't you ever humiliated, like complaining about us to people? And she's like, because everyone complained about their kids. They loved them, but sort of like, but kids are annoying, and they don't get much right. You spend most of your time saying no. So, it's like, why wouldn't we talk about it? And I just sort of wonder where that went. Like, do you have any thoughts? Like, what happened to parents talking about not only their kids' trophies and scholarships and recitals, but talking about suspensions and D's and F's and was in trouble last weekend for drinking, and cops were at the house, and like, how come people don't talk about that anymore? Any ideas? Embarrassment, yeah.
They're worried about it being on Facebook.
Oh, that's interesting. Yes, that's right. That's right. We do like to share globally now, right? We would like everyone to know pieces of information. Embarrassment. Where do you think embarrassment grew from? How come there wasn't more embarrassment in the 60s? I mean, there's probably always been embarrassment, but there wasn't more of it in the 60s and 70s. How come we got like really sensitive to what parents think of us as parents?
Do you think it's because we're more entwined with our children, and so it's more of a reflection on us as a bad parent?
Yeah, so the idea was that given parents these days are more connected to their kids, and more of their identity is connected to their kids, that somehow their kid not doing well does sort of seem like a reflection on them. That is true. I do not recall my mother ever going to I had a single parent, one anything, like one meet, one game, she worked. Like, she was always interested at supper. How was your game? How was your meet? How'd you do? But the idea, and I have parents like crying in my office. I'm like, oh, you're crying already? We haven't even started. And they'll say sort of like, oh, I shouldn't have scheduled it at this time. My daughter has a tennis match today, and I told her I'd be there, and I feel horrible that I'm not there. And I'm like, well, what will happen to her? Like, maybe you should go. And she'll say, oh, she probably won't even notice. And I'm sort of thinking like, well, what is that? I get some weird kind of attachment. Or, I went to every one of my kids' football games all 4 years. And it's like, would you want like a medal for that? Like, I'm I'm not sure. Like, I'm not sure.
How do you think it is? I mean, I feel like it's possibly a reaction to maybe how the generation was parented.
But I don't remember missing anyone coming. You just sort of like, there were always some smattering of mothers and fathers, but, people weren't necessarily jealous of those parents. Now, when I was in like a show or something, my mother would come, but those were evenings if I was in a play or something. But yeah, that's interesting, that sort of like, is it a backlash? Is it a backlash? Yeah.
I also think before parents took things head on, something happened, they dealt with it, and there was discipline, and there were consequences. It was less of a wanting to be a friend to your child than being a parent to your child. And today there's a lot of, they tiptoe around, they get rid of them. And therefore you wouldn't express to your friends because this would seem cool.
Because it'd be like sort of ratting out your friend, right? Oh, that's interesting. And sort of like...
Mostly the person feels it's a reflection on
On them.
lack of skills and parenting.
Some of the research is thinking that it's related to parents working too much, more divorced families, and guilt. And so they don't want to talk about their kids' failings because they are quite sure it's most likely because they've not done a good job. Because of work, because of marriages, because of. But I like these ideas just as much. That this over-identification with children, my child's pain is my pain, my child's victory is my victory. I do think there's a difference between being happy for your kids and sharing in their award-winning behavior. Like, it's not your trophy. And so, how do you convey a sense of pride and happiness for them, but let it be theirs versus it's everybody's?
I think, too, that people measure their insides with what they see on other people's outsides.
Yeah.
And so they feel like, wow, look at that family has it all together, or whatever. And, instead of seeing that everybody has issues. It happens all the time.
All the time.
But everybody's afraid to crack that nut, except with a very close friends or something like that.
And sometimes not even then.
Yeah, right.
Like, I just sort of think, what a lost opportunity. I will challenge all of you, and I will appreciate emails on how it went, to just try complaining about your kids somewhere and watch how uncomfortable everyone is. And they'll try to tell you it's okay and you'll be all right, and I'm sure she didn't mean it, and he's a good kid. And it's like, no, I just want to be annoyed. Like, don't your kids ever annoy you? Do I say something? Do I not say something? I was like, it's like, I just sort of chalk it up to child development, and sort of but test it and see, because I do sort of think if you could seed some complaining about children, because they're worth complaining about.
Does anyone not complain about their kids and their friends and people? I don't think that's
Right.
an issue.
Right. Yes. No. Right. So this might be a bit of the choir. But I don't know if someone here who doesn't complain about their kids would say that they don't, because they might be nervous about that. Yeah. And would you tell everybody that your daughter's in trouble for sexting? Or it's like, well, I'm not going to really talk about some things. My son has a court date. Oh, really? What happened? Not good. Breaking and entering. I think those are worth talking about. I think it's really good to hear another mother or another father say, I am so sorry. That must be so hard. How are you dealing with it? Oh, I want to kill him. Or, I'm grocery shopping now at midnight so I don't run into people. That one's pretty popular. I just talked to a mom recently whose son got kicked out of college. He went away for freshman year. He lasted about a month. He got into enough trouble in a month that the school sort of said, we're kind of done with you for now. Like, take some time off, grow up a little bit, and you can give us a try again in another year. But she said she's so embarrassed for him. He's so embarrassed. And she is so worried that someone's going to see him and then ask her why he's home, and she won't know what to say. So she grocery shops like after midnight. And yet she would tell you that she has good friends and lives in a wonderful neighborhood. And in fact, they chose their neighborhood because it was kid-friendly and there's lots of families. It's like, wow, something. See, I'd say they live in a town, not a community. So I'm happy to hear you are all complaining about your children. But you know, this outward stuff, I think Barb, you said these are things that people can look on the outside. You know, how much of these things are outside stuff? You know, food. You know, I hear parents talking, you know, about like what other people have in their shopping cart at the store. Can you believe what they bought? Both ways. Can you believe they are on food stamps and buying organic food? And can you believe they feed their kids, you know, Doritos? You know, a box of 24 Doritos. And so they're like, oh my God, they send their kids to school with Doritos? That's terrible. You know, watching all the time. Schools are very challenging in a small town because they tend to be staffed by people who live there. That staff tends to have kids who go to that school or other schools in the same community. You know, you don't like your kid's teacher and it's also your neighbor. Or you don't like your kid's teacher and it's also your boss's husband. You know, so it's like, So lots of layers. In family systems theory, we would call that a series of interlocking triangles, where there's all these triangles of people in terms of how we're connected, and they're all like stacked up on top of each other, and then they start panning out this way. And boy, schools can be a hotbed of interlocking triangles in a community. It's some of why I think schools are under so much stress. You know, taxpayers put stress on schools, parents put stress on schools, schools put stress on themselves, the federal government puts stresses on schools, and then schools put pressure on kids. And kids bring that home, and they have stressed out parents who then put more pressure on the schools. I'm pretty convinced that the reason when school board budgets don't get passed, it's not because the schools are lousy, but it's sort of like one of the few voices that parents have in their communities, is at least I can turn down that. I can't get Congress to work, but damn it, I'm going to make sure that they don't pass that school budget this year with that bond in it. Affairs. It's always fascinating to watch affairs in communities. We have a lot of those. You probably don't have any down here. But it is so funny, sort of like, I'm just always a little fascinated. And if any of you are having an affair or have had an affair, it's not a judgment against you. But sort of like, I do think it's kind of funny how like people will like date their neighbor or their kid's teacher or the babysitter or the local banker, you know, and it's like, when do you think we're not going to know? You know, it's like really that small, that small. God, you know, she goes to the bank a lot. It's like, yeah. Clothes, we watch each other's clothes a lot. Education, we can be pretty snarky about education. Restaurants, being out and seeing who's out and who's with who and what they're doing there. Pets, we can be very critical of each other's pets and also very judgmental about other people's pets. And around here, you know, that can be, you know, horses too, not just cats and dogs and hamsters. Buys and sells, I was thinking of you, Cindy. Realtors know a lot in a town. Yes, and people watch what's, you know, most people sort of look at the for sale section in their own communities, even when they're not looking, because they're looking to see who's selling what and how much they're getting for it. And sometimes people will go so far as after it's sold, they'll go to City Hall to sort of see, did they really sell it for $459, even though that's what they were asking? And it's all online for Warren. So you can be doing it in your pajamas. Yes, in your pajamas. And appointments. And I think appointments are sort of with all professionals. I think sort of, one of the things that Hannah's House has tried to do is sort of create a mental health center that is integrated into the community so that it would have less charge to it. But I have clients that drive 2 hours, some from New Hampshire, because they don't want to see anybody in their state or anyone in their town. Because they'll say, everyone will know everything, because they'll just watch you walk into that building. And the smaller the town, the more often services like doctors, dentists, obstetricians, or gynecologists are in really small practice settings. And so, when you get out of your car with your 13-year-old daughter that you found out was having sex, and so you sort of think it's time for you to go see a gynecologist and maybe talk about birth control, and as you're walking through the parking lot, 2 people on the road driving by and wave, and where else could you be going? And mothers usually don't bring their daughters to the gynecologist. Mothers will bring daughters, but not usually sort of like, you want to come to my gynecological appointment with me? It will be fun, let's go. Yeah. So the struggles are very similar, very similar, but incredibly complex. And we watch each other. We cannot help it. Many years ago, a group of researchers they took as many aspects of human behavior as they could possibly chart, log, like everything we do, picking our noses and brushing our teeth and working and showering and crying and like sort of everything that we do, to see if it is done in the animal world in general. And everything humans do, we can find some animal who does that too. Maybe not the same way we do, but does that too, except for one thing, that gossip is fundamentally human. Now, maybe that's because we don't speak squirrel, and so we don't know if the squirrels are complaining about the other squirrels in the next tree. But and there may be some dolphins, talked about each other. But gossip is fundamentally human. So the idea of like don't gossip, that's like saying don't breathe. So how do you sort of not think about? And I think of gossip like stress. When people say, I just want less stress. It's like there's no such thing as less stress. What you can change is your relationship to stress and your response to stress, but stress is just a given. It's like, I don't know how, I think even the Dalai Lama is stressed. Why wouldn't you? You've been kicked out of your own country, and dissonance wants you. And when you fly to New York and you have to go through Geneva and your flight's delayed, or canceled. I'm sure the Dalai Lama goes like this. Can you put me on another flight? Oh, I'm sorry, Lama. We only have one. But first thing in the morning, it's like, I need to be there tomorrow morning. Although he probably has handlers, so that helps too. So if you can get a handler, that will help with stress. But won't help with gossip, because handlers will actually encourage the gossip. So gossip is a fundamentally human form of communication. It's some way we keep track of each other, and it's some way we stay connected. I do think there are differences between destructive gossip and good gossip. Just like I think there's distress relative to the response to stress, and there's eustress, E-U-S-T-R-E-S-S, which is the positive effects of stress. And so similarly, I think of gossip as being there's good gossip and there's destructive gossip. Now, destructive gossip has a social capital component to it, that you have something to gain somehow in terms of power, prestige, influence, control, by the movement of information. And so it's very tactical. Now, if you think of some of the best gossip hounds you know, you might sort of say, oh, it doesn't look very tactical. They just look like they just run their mouths all the time about everyone else's business. It is tactical. There is something to be, there's some sort of social capital to be gained by moving information. And so someone who's moving a lot of information is in need of a lot of social capital. Their social capital account is running low. And a lot of organizations will have someone just like that in their organization. And they always tend to be people that have been there a really long time. And they know everything, and they will tell you everything. And if they don't know it, they will say things like, "Let me find out, and I'll let you know." And gossip is not reserved. You know, women get accused of, men are even worse gossips than women. They're just more subtle, you know, because women's gossip is like this, and men just go. But it's all the same stuff. And they're just as harsh and critical and in need of social capital as women are. Good gossip. Now, good gossip is a hard one to sort of think about, because it is talking about people, but it comes from a place of wanting to understand something as opposed to wanting to gain something. So a good example would be, I heard the other day that, Mary Beth and Tom were getting divorced. Did you hear that? No, I didn't hear that. Oh, that would really surprise me. Well, it would really surprise me too. I thought they were doing really well. Well, you never really know. I think sometimes that can look like, psst, but I think it's that sort of like, how do couples decide to stay together and come apart? I think those are kinds of conversations where that person might go home and say to their spouse or partner, sort of like, I heard that, Tom and Mary Beth are splitting up. Do you think we'd ever split up? Or what would we do if we split up? Or what would split us up? I think there is some attempt to want to understand something. Another one would be sort of a kid being in trouble. I heard that, Darlene's son was arrested again. Oh my God, you're kidding. Like, he's going to be in prison before he gets out of high school. When that's not destructive, it's also a parent who's got a kid that they wonder sort of like, how would I handle that situation? What would I do if I had a kid that was getting in trouble with the law a lot and I don't know what to do? So there is some value about talking about each other to other people. Ideally, we could talk about ourselves, but sometimes that's a little too vulnerable. And so I think we do it by talking about other people's issues and then trying to relate them to our lives in some way. So notice when you're moving information, because remember, you can't not, it's fundamentally human. Any person who tells me I've never gossiped, I don't believe them. That sort of like, notice where it's coming from. Notice if there's some sort of gain or some sort of positive you're hoping to get out of it other than understanding. And sometimes it's hard to discern the two. The best way to discern the two is if you really care about their response. If you don't really care about their response, but you just sort of want to like move the information around, it's probably more of the destructive kind. But if you're really interested, and not their response like this, like not that response, but like their word response, like, oh my God, I feel so bad. Should we ask her, if that's true or that we heard something? I think like that therapist that called me, sort of like, she was hearing, I think she was probably not hearing destructive gossip, because I think I probably would have heard that faster myself. I think she was probably hearing a lot of good gossip and got anxious. Until someone started, well, you know him really well, call him. But I think it was trying to understand sort of like, could I really be, trafficking child porn? Maybe, I see adolescents, and so I think probably people got worried, and had that been me, I think there would have been very interesting conversations going on in the mental health community in terms of how do we know? How do we know which therapists are like ones you can trust and which ones you can't? And, my God, he's been 25 years. Has he been doing this for 25 years? Or is this something that happened recently? And if it happened recently, why did it happen? And like, could it happen to me? And could it happen to the other people in my practice? And like it would have, but I don't know as if that's necessarily negative. I think there's some attempt to want to understand how we function as a species, in a collective, since most of us live on the grid in some way. How do we interface with each other? And talking about people is one way we do it. One way we do it. I don't know if you can see this. It's so funny. She's got a sweater over her head, and it's a sweater designed to also go over her laptop and her keyboard. Yes, extreme. Some people take their privacy a little too seriously. So now you have the, so I've been talking a lot about talk more, say more, watch more, realize community is about connection. How do we facilitate connection? How do we see the people around us as assets versus liabilities? Some of the purpose of this parenting series is to build a stronger cohort of parents in the community so that if you see each other enough at things, you might actually seek each other out at other times when it could be useful because you would have had a context of sort of working together in some way, particularly useful for families that don't feel very well connected in their community. It's hard though because sometimes these things get the people that are already connected well in their community. But if you are somebody who's connected well, can you pay attention to the people that seem to sort of be outliers? And how do they get invited in some way without feeling threatened? And that being said, then there's privacy. Like some people just don't talk about themselves. I met with a young man today, he's 16 going on 17. I've only met with him a couple of times. He's had a rough time of it. And so today he said, and it was very interesting because I was a bit bored for 10 or 15 minutes with the conversation. And I sort of thought like, oh, is it like my blood sugar or is it just kind of boring? And, you know, because I'm sure I'm boring too. And so he said, so I really don't want our meetings to like go like this for very long. And I said, what do you mean? He goes, I just feel like I could probably keep coming in and saying the same thing every week, and you would say the same thing every week, and then nothing would change. And I said, well, I was having the same thought. I was thinking you were kind of boring. And then I thought, well, maybe I'm just kind of boring because maybe I'm like tired or got low blood sugar or something. And so he's like, no, I did see a therapist once before, and that's what happened to us. And he said, I don't know if I'm just a very private person or if I don't like opening up. And I said, well, you're going to have to figure that out because that's a whole different route for me. If you're just private, then you got to teach me how to respect your privacy. If you have a hard time opening up and you'd like to be better at opening up, then I can poke at you in ways to sort of, you know, help you be a more open person. But he said, I'm not sure. And so I actually said, why don't you think about it and why don't you think about it and email me your thoughts, because he's a big online person. So on the drive down here, I get an email from him that said, yeah, I'm not going to be emailing you anything. I'll talk to you next time I see you. And I thought, good. I said, well, good. I'm glad you figured it out. You know, but I just sort of thought, like, I think he got clear that this is not about privacy. This is more about sort of like it's just hard for me to open up. And I would imagine sort of if he's going to talk to people and the people are all about him and he doesn't want to open up, you're not really going to go very far. It's going to get boring fast. And this got boring kind of fast. You know, I've only seen him a couple of sessions. So how do we understand people's privacy separate from their fear, their lack of community, their lack of involvement, their overwhelming distress? Some families have so many stressors in them that the idea of community just even seems even more overwhelming because it feels like it's one more thing I'd have to do. I'd have to care about other people, you know? And so it's like, you know, one of the nice parts about living in a community, small town living, is that they don't have to give back at the same way, at the same level you give. You know, so if you're generous of time or interest or concern, they don't have to be as interested in you and your family for it to be successful. That sometimes I think a family is in a more need position. Other times it's in a more generous position. A lot of families tell me that after their kids are somewhat launched, that they sort of feel incredibly generous about helping and parenting and talking to people because it's sort of like I'm kind of done. And then you talk to, no, it's okay. Didn't know if you were missing me and wanted to wave. Okay, all right. So how do we accept people's privacy? How can we have an appreciation for it? Some people interpret other people's privacy as rude. Here I've told you so much about me, and now I ask you, and you put on your fake face and tell me everything's fine, even though I know it's not, because my kids told me it's not. And so then we're mad, and we sort of take this personally. I don't know as if we're supposed to take it personally, or if we're supposed to appreciate that sort of where somebody's at that moment, and get some neutrality about it. It's privacy is not meant to be a game changer in the course of relationships. It is not uncommon for a child who was sexually abused as a kid to not say something till they're adults. And when they say something when they're adults, their parents are usually horrified and say, "Why didn't you tell us?" And they have all kinds of good reasons, but they're usually kid reasons, not really adult reasons. And parents are so disappointed that they couldn't have done more or said more or responded better. And so they actually are mad and disappointed that they weren't given the chance to do something better. To that adult son or daughter who discloses something like that, that's like saying, so on top of being sexually abused and then you don't say anything about it for 15 years, now like you're telling me that I did that all wrong and I should have done it better and that you're disappointed in me. And so I think sort of like, how do you get neutral about the way people manage information? A much more useful response to a parent would be sort of like, "I'm sad to hear that. Was it hard to not talk to us for so many years?" Or what kind of pressure did you feel inside about whether to keep it a secret or whether to say something? Really neutral language about talking about things that we want to take so personally. Like, "I can't believe you didn't say something." It's like, great, so now I'm getting yelled at again at 24, for something that happened at 9. So it is challenging, and we're not always very neutral about the way other people manage information. We're not even neutral about how we manage information as a government. If anyone heard, Angela Merkel was really mad at Barack Obama since she found out that her cell phone was one of the cell phones that the NSA was listening to. Barack said, "Don't worry, it's not your phone." I'm sure it was, sort of like, if you have an opportunity to listen to a chancellor's cell phone calls, like, really? Really? Remember, we can go back. Really? 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 Yeah, really? We wouldn't? You're some drone for the NSA, and it's sort of like, now whose call is this? Angela Merkel? Yeah. Doesn't necessarily mean they said anything about it. Yeah. All right. So pain. So some of why some people like living in cities is because everyone there is in pain too at various times. We just don't know them and we don't know their pain. In small towns, we do know each other's pain. You go to a funeral of somebody in the town, everyone is in the same place. You read something in the paper that's disturbing. We are very connected as mammals to each other's pain. There's some documentation that when animals come upon a dead animal, that they actually have some kind of grief response, that they sort of stop and look at it and sort of know that it's dead. So there is something mammalian. I don't think, the animals that only have a base brain, like reptiles, food, sex, fight, or flee. You know, they don't even know their own offspring. You know, mammals, the big middle part of the brain is the relationship part of the brain. You know, like a bear mother knows her cubs from the other cubs. You know, they're not just all cubs. And also know the difference between, you know, other animals. You know, we're not really so sure that, you know, mosquitoes know that or care. Or their lifespan's so short, they probably have very little time. They no education. So pain, so yours and others. So living in a small town is being more connected to things that are very hard. And so again, privacy. Do some people sort of wall up when things are going on because, you know, walls are sometimes to keep people out, but often they are to hold somebody together. And how we experience those walls makes a very big difference. I tried to help somebody. I gave them lots of opportunities. I brought up things, you know, and sort of like, you know, so I give up. It's sort of like, yes, you feel walled out, but you might not realize that that person is walling in because they're afraid there's just too much spillage. And so they're trying to hold themselves together. So again, how do you hold neutral? And so making yourself part of a community and not an island in the sea of ordinary. That was so poetic of me for somebody who's not very creative whatsoever. Yeah, I mean, we are all really phenomenally ordinary. You know, just like it's astounding to me how ordinary we all are. I mean, probably one of the best benefits I've had in my job as a therapist is to sort of think like, it's just the same. You know, not cookie cutter same, but it's relationship struggles, it's births and deaths, it's loss, it's change, you know, it's finances, it's childhoods, it's like it's you know, how people deal with all of that is all different, but you know, we're really kind of all the same. We're kind of all the same. I don't think there's, you know, probably much different going on in the head of Mark Wiener when he's sexting all the people of New York State who want to see him sext, you know, and some, you know, 17-year-old, you know, at Harwood who's looking to get lucky, you know, or Mark Zuckerberg who wants a date, so founds Facebook. You know, it's kind of all the same. So recognizing the ordinariness, I think, can make living in a small town much easier than to think that there are people that are really amazing and people that are terrible and people that are, you know, better than us and worse than us, and sort of like, you know, we're all pretty extraordinarily ordinary. Your marriage isn't any better or worse than anybody else's. You know, no one's kids are smarter or dumber than your kids. You know, it's sort of like, you know, every kid's got some asset and some liability. Every marriage has got its warts and freckles and wrinkles. But we can get really lost in that list of things that we are watching each other about. We are keen watchers. And I have noticed in communities where there's a lot of closeness in the community, not too much, not meddling kind of closeness, that there is less need to watch people because they're talking to people. So, you know, if I'm in the grocery store and I'm noticing what everyone else is buying, that's very different than I have relationships in this community, and so I'm going over to people's baskets to talk to them. And we can have conversations about even food without me sort of having to watch their food and then think about it and then tell somebody about it. Because we do like to tell. We do like to tell people. And so I'll be curious if you can notice the differences between when you're gossiping destructively, and you will, you can't help it, you know, you can't help it, And didn't Jesus like flip the table at the synagogue when he got pissed off at the merchants or something? And so like we all have our unsavory moments. You know, even if you're the savior of the world and the son of God, you know, you still get yelled at by your mother and you still misbehave, you know, and you're still disappointed in your friends and you still try to get out of doing hard stuff, you know. So sort of like, you know, we can take, whether real or mythic, you know, perfect people, you know, and still like find their flaws. Extraordinarily ordinary. Extraordinarily ordinary. So I'm interested in some questions, some comments, some thoughts. This is a hard topic in terms of like sometimes people don't want to talk about communities in communities because then they think that people will be thinking they're thinking something or not thinking something, and if you could all just stop being so damn sensitive, you'll do fine. But I'm just curious as to sort of your thoughts about small town living, your thoughts about some of the things I mentioned, even if they just seemed ridiculous to you.
And we have a mic here that won't amplify you, but
It will get on the camera, yes. So we can maybe pass the mic.
And if you want to do that, or if you want to have the video stopping now for the questions, you can do that too. What are you more comfortable?
Well, people can ask me questions, and then I'll just repeat them since I'm mic'd already. And then we don't have, you know, crazy camera swinging. Yeah, yeah. And Oprah. Sally Jesse, Phil Donahue. Boy, we're dating ourselves. Yes, yes. You were going to have a question? You lost your train of thought. You know, I've heard that
No,
happens.
but I know what it is. I think it's people's innate need to create communities no matter where they are. And I remember when we had a child going off to choosing a school, and my husband was really, really upset because she was thinking of a school with 35,000 undergraduates, and he'd gone to a small, all-guys school, and he just couldn't imagine. And within that, she went to Michigan, and within that giant underclass group, they created communities that were very small town and resembled exactly what you are talking about. And I just think it's most people's nature to want to be part of something, and it's just sad when it doesn't happen, when you're not part of, when you're on an island.
Yeah, yeah. You know, that sense of wanting to belong. Alfred Adler was one of Freud's disciples. Carl Jung, a couple of other ones. And Adler, what was the name of Adler's theory? Adlerian theory. There we go. Funny how he named it after himself. And but he had as one of his fundamental tenets of mental disease, which he hyphenated dis-ease, which is sort of disease as being not at ease, was a people's sense of belonging. And when I look at some of the characters that we have on Church Street in Burlington that have chronic mental health problems and have been in the system for a long time, you know, I wonder to what extent being chronically mentally ill and not fitting has on behavior. That's sort of like if you don't fit, then you are at dis-ease, and so then who cares what I say and do on the street? Because I'm not connected anywhere. So I can mumble to myself, I can scream at people I don't know, I can do all kinds of things because I'm not connected. So I think, right, even in a school of 35,000 undergraduates, that's a big school. That's pretty much the size of Burlington. You know, to sort of like find and make a small cohort community is pretty significant. I think we are drawn to be together. We live like this, you know, for a reason. Some people choose to live really away and cut off from people, but they tend to have some dis-ease with things. Yes?
I think just humans in general, we want to belong to something bigger.
Yeah.
It's part of the group, and that's still part of the religion. You know, you believe you belong to something bigger. You know, the Lions Club.
Yeah.
There's just certain clubs where they can, you know, one day a week, you know, from 5 to 8, I'm a lion. It's part of something, you know, we do eyeglasses, you know,
Yeah.
And I just think that's a, you know, general belief in the humanity. We all belong to there.
We all want to
And
belong.
I just love growing up in a small town because I was living here for 3 years and I was thinking I should probably be hitting the road, maybe, you know, and I just had to graduate school and I was going to do something else.
Mm-hmm.
And then I had my accident.
Mm-hmm.
And the town came together so much to
Mhm.
help me
Yeah.
and to offer me work, you know.
Yep.
It's just amazingly, you know, just fantastic stuff. After my accident and my recovery, I'd be a fool to go anywhere.
Yeah. Yes. 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 You wouldn't have had that kind of community on the road. You know, if I was going to hit the road, you know, you'd pretty much be just you on the road. Yeah. Yeah. Go ahead.
I can't shake, though, the guilt thing that you were talking about.
Yeah.
When I experience saying to my 11-year-old what my mother never even had to say to me.
Mm-hmm.
It was just expected that, okay, you go here, I can't be home until then, you're going to do this. When I get home, the water should be boiling for the pasta. And when I just today said, I can't be home in time, I think, okay, you're going to walk to the library, guilt, quarter of a mile. You're going to walk to the library, you're going to start your homework, and I'll pick you up by 6.
Yeah.
And I think, what am I should have done something else.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, what's the difference? Where's the chasm between myself and my mother?
Mm-hmm.
That it was just,
Mhm.
it wasn't even, it didn't have to be said for her.
Mm-hmm.
But I just want to, you know, flog myself.
Mhm.
Going, oh, well, maybe I can take her out to dinner, you know,
Right.
make it up to her.
So this guilt that you have for just parenting in the best ways you know how, what was your sense of yourself and your community of friends and your neighborhood when you were 11?
Oh, it was just a, you know, everything was a gang and a constant surrounding of, if not parents and what we call big kids,
Right.
just peers, you know, a herd.
Mm.
And you'd go out after school, you'd come in for dinner, you'd go out again until dark, you'd come in, and you'd go out again in the morning.
Mm-hmm. So does your 11-year-old have a gang?
Well,
Not in our country, rural community where we don't have
no, you know, on
neighborhoods.
my road, I think you have to go half a mile before
Yeah.
you find anything other than a part-time resident / retiree
Mm-hmm.
that would say, get off of my lawn.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I think that's when you want to,
Geographic.
right, but I think that that's some of that chasm that you're wondering what it is that sort of like, you know, how do, even in small places like this, how do you give kids gangs? You know, so that your son would see this as an amazing opportunity, that I'm not stuck with you and I can go over to Billy's for dinner and maybe even stay over, even though it's a school night and that hardly ever happens, but it's sort of like, well, if Billy's mother says it's all right, you can. You know, where it's sort of like, I don't need you. You know, I don't need you as much.
Yeah, so we've noticed that our daughter, like when she's at a day with friends, I mean, she's great. And there's, you know, I mean, we don't feel guilty. And I mean, it's just she's had a great day and everything's, you know, awesome.
Yeah.
And, you know, when she's trying to do something and we're around the house and we feel like we have to do something, you know,
Yeah.
some of that goes into it.
Yeah, I don't think 11 is too young to say get a life. Except that 11's too young to necessarily get a life by yourself. Like you might need some help getting a life. But you know, like the idea of like, so I can't be home until 6. What do you want to do to keep yourself safe and entertained till then. Now, I want to try staying home by myself. Sort of like, 11, sort of that age that sometimes parents are willing to try it for 2 hours. Or it's sort of like, I'd want to go to a friend's house. Can you arrange that? That's sort of like, if as several of you have said, we are just drawn to a sense of community, how do we teach kids to be drawn to communities outside of their families? So they build, even at 11, what you want them to do in college, and when they move to Cleveland at 30, and when they move back to Vermont, because Cleveland's awful, at 35. That's sort of like, I want them to have that experience of having to manage themselves.
But how do you incorporate that into their frustrating need for their parents, because we live in a rural community?
Yeah.
Super rural, they truly, truly need us.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then there's the sense of guilt if we're not, and you're compensating, or one is compensating potentially, you're compensating for not being in the burbs or not being in the city.
Yep.
So you have a little bit of a weird, not exotic, but it's,
Yeah.
people are like, what are you doing? We are hiding out there.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah. And then people from New York come to visit you, and they sort of say, like, oh my God, it's so beautiful here. You must love it. And it's like, yeah.
You do.
Yeah.
There you go.
But no, but that's the thing.
I know, but we do.
Because you're
Yeah.
just like you just say, we do.
We do. It's beautiful.
Share the craft.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. We don't talk about mud season with very many people, but it's a lot of mud. Right. But I think kind of, the guilt as you described it, which I think is really great, is that sort of like they really need us. But what they might need more from you is your ability to help them problem solve and to transport, not to be their community. Because I think that's where the guilt comes from, is that they want me because there ain't anybody else to want here right now. And it's like, And so if that becomes the synergy between the two of you, I need you and you need me, I need you and you need me, then they will have a harder time later on, or until they get a driver's license, and that always helps in the country. But sort of like to sort of think like, I have nothing to feel guilty about, except if I'm not willing to drive them to a friend's house or help them think about whose house they could go to until I get out at 7:30, 8 o'clock. Like I can be useful in that way, but I don't necessarily have to feel guilty because I'm not going to hang out with them. And I think if you can peel those two apart, that my obligation by living in the country with somebody who can't necessarily problem solve or transport themselves is to do those things, and when I'm not doing those, you feel as guilty as you want. But the fact that like I don't want to hang out with you, or that you're going to have to wait a half hour to see my mug, it's like, yeah, well, suffer that whole half hour. Cry and write me love letters the entire time. Of what it would have been like if we had been together for those 30 minutes and all the fun we would have had. But I think it's like, how do I see more and more kids, especially with this stuff, this is great in terms of connection, especially for kids in the country, the internet and texting, because it is a way to sort of feel like you're with some other people. It's not as authentic as being face-to-face with people. But I see kids that have really interesting, fun school lives and don't really do anything with kids after school or on weekends. They don't call kids up to see what they're doing. They are pretty isolated. And boy, when you get to high school and that's what your life's looking like, it gets really sad. Or if you're an athlete, and once the season's over, you've got nothing. You've got like no social life. Because you're too nervous to call somebody up, or you live too far away, or it's you only have one car in your family and you don't have a driver's license, so to call somebody up and invite them to do something, you'd have to make them do the movement, and you feel like you can't call up a friend and say, hi, do you want to like hang out, but your parents have to bring you over because I'm stuck here. And so like, yeah, that's what you would do. You would say that. And they look at me sort of like, I'm not ever going to say that. And it's like, okay, be miserable then. That's the other option. So the guilt, guilt is really good. It separates us from sociopaths. Without it, we'd be lost. But you're supposed to save it for really meaty things. Like you're not supposed to have a diet every day of some guilt. This isn't M&Ms that you take a few every time you walk by the bowl. Guilt's supposed to be for special occasions when you have real screwed up royally. Like, oh my God, screwed up. You know, like get home. Children at Warren, you know, because those other children could have called their parents and sort of like, yeah, feel really bad. And the nice part about guilt, I've never understood as a Catholic, when people sort of say, you know, Catholic guilt, I'm like, are you kidding? Like, we're the luckiest guilty people because you can go to confession like every day if you want. It's not like the Day of Atonement, you know, where you get like one day, you know, to dump all your sins. So every day I could go if I wanted to and say, okay, this is yesterday's list and this is it. Like, why would I be keeping it? I can unload it like this. But for you non-Catholics, you know, it's sort of like when you're guilty, you have to make sure you did something, like 2 pieces of cheesecake and I feel so guilty. It's like, no, you're not supposed to feel guilty about that. You take responsibility for what you did, you apologize, and you make amends, and then you're done. You're done. You know, guilt is not a feeling in my mind. Guilt is a thought. I think it's a thought because it doesn't act like any of my other feelings. If my dog gets run over, I don't try to figure out which feeling to have. I feel sad and mad. It just kind of comes naturally. But guilt, you'll notice how we think about guilt. Well, I'm not going to feel guilty about that. You know, or I think she was trying to make me feel guilty. Or that was a guilt trip. And sort of like, but whoever, you're putting me on a joy trip, aren't you? Yeah, you're trying to get me on a sad trip, aren't you? We don't use our feelings like that. So I think there's such a cognitive process to guilt that it's not in the feeling world, even though we use words, I feel guilty. So I encourage you to sort of use words like, I'm thinking more guilty right now. Because it is a thought process. You know, so if I promised Cindy I would come tonight, and I don't come to do this talk tonight, I should feel really bad. Yes. I apologize profusely. I take responsibility for my actions. I had it written down. I just didn't look at my calendar. And then I make amends. You pick the night. Any night, I will be there. And if I have to reschedule something else, I will. And it's like, well, we'd like to try one on a Saturday morning. And I'm thinking, damn, I don't really want to. It's like, Saturday morning sounds great. Sounds great, you know. But then if like 6 months later, Cindy's like, you know, I don't know if we want to get you again because, you know, we had that problem that one night in Warren, you know, and I'm like thinking maybe like, oh, she still like wants me to feel bad about this. And you know what? I'm done. I did it, you know. And so I might sort of say like, you're really still having a hard time with that Warren gig, aren't you? It's really upsetting you. Well, I just don't think like you're upset enough about it. And it's like, you're right, I'm not. I'm all done. I took responsibility, I made amends, and I apologize. I feel pretty clean about it. You know, is it my shining moment? No. But I'm feeling kind of done. You know, and I don't do that with my other feelings. You know, my dead pet, I'm never done. Like I can still think about him or her and go, oh, I miss them. You know, it's sort of like, so I don't think of guilt as a feeling. So if you're thinking guilty, it's sort of like, you got to make sure you did something really good and awful. Like not modest and awful. You know, and I can't be home at my regularly scheduled time does not fall in this therapist's category of awful enough. Or look what we did to our kids by living out here. It's like, yeah, that is not awful enough. But if you are a parent who hates driving their kids everywhere, I tell those parents, too bad. You did this to your kids. You drive them places, even if you don't feel like it. You drive a 15-year-old at 8 o'clock to a friend's house, even though they have to be home by 10, because you picked the house. They would have picked a different house, not yours. You know, even if they have horses, you know, they still would have picked a better house. So those kinds of things feel good and guilty about. But in general, it's way overused. It's way, way, way overused. You're not supposed to be this guilty unless you're really that despicable. You know, and then I think you need some corrective action. You were going to say something.
I was going to say something about the role of
parents that are divorced or no longer together.
Yeah.
And how the guilt sort of compounds. If the most you ever have your child is 50% of the time, that's an awful feeling for a lot of parents. And they have tremendous guilt about wanting to spend every moment doing something that's meaningful and fun and, you know, enjoyable. And it's harder, I think. And I wonder from the child's perspective as well, if they feel like they need to be with their parents more so than exploring social options if they're only with their parent for 50% of the time.
Usually, no. Usually, it's they are with their parent more because they perceive their parent as needing them more. And the parent might be needing them more because they're feeling bad about the fact that I don't get to see you as much. I have seen really amazing results with divorced parents who return to parenting the way they always wanted to, but then they got divorced. Like their kids, it's their day to have, their week to have the kids, and they have the kids, and they're still a hard ass, and they still won't let them do stuff, and they still make them go outside and play, and those kids do so much better. They do so much better. And I think that has more to do with parenting out of principle than parenting out of feeling. I don't know as if kids turn out as well when their parents parent with their feelings. And so if you've got some ideas about kids need to be outside, kids need to play with their friends, kids do not need to watch this much TV, no, you can't use my iPad, I know I'm not using it, I don't care, it's mine, stop bugging me about it. This whole idea like, you know, I can't be like firm with my kid. It's been some great experiments to watch sort of like in a divorce family where one parent returns to parenting the way they always wanted to parent but stopped, and the other parents from guilt or sadness or loss or pain, that over the long term, the child likes the parent that was harder. They find something really cloying and clingy to the parent whose feelings get hurt too much, and they like the parent who's straight. And it's interesting, the turnaround seems to be between 17 and 19, because you sort of like the person who's all about you, will buy you whatever you want and do whatever you want, and the other one is just so mean all the time, you know. And then something different, like between 17 and 19, we're sort of like the meaner one just is like the person I want to call to ask questions, or I'm first year of college and I'm like having a hard time. You know, if I call the nice one, they're going to like come and get me or send me home or move in with me. And the other one will tell me what to do.
It's smothering.
Yeah, yeah. Mothering with an S, yes. Smothering, yes, yeah, yes.
I think a lot of the deal with divorced families is, you know, it's not amicable. You're constantly worried, you know, the other parent's going to use this against me if I make, you know, a decision. You know, like, for example, tonight, I made the decision that this was important to Mom, and you girls are old enough to look after each other for a couple of hours. But I dropped one of my daughters off and then met my ex on the road, and I was like, oh crap, he's going to see that she's not with me, and then I'm headed elsewhere, and it's like, you know, and then it's going to be the whole discussion, why are you leaving the kids alone, and it's not safe, but you know, I took the time to make the arrangements.
Yeah.
I had a neighbor close by who was a go-to person in an emergency. I made sure that dinner was warm and the stove was off, and they still, you know.
Yeah.
But I think a lot of the guilt, I mean, in my case, it's you're constantly worried about what the other parent's going to say. Now they're going to use it against me, and I'm going to have less time with my kids because, you know, I mean, you can make a court believe anything.
You can. Poor
But
courts.
I don't think it's necessarily, I don't know, I mean, I think within a marriage that's together, you're still fighting for the soul of your kids. Similarly, one is nice, one isn't, I mean, I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't think, I swear, I think.
That it's not that different. Yeah, you know, I would agree with you, except that usually the courts aren't involved in those kinds of families. You know, I guess I'm of the mindset that your own life cannot be used against you. If your plan makes perfect sense to you, and you could run it up a flagpole, and you would do the same thing again tomorrow and next week, then if you go to jail or you lose your kids, that's an unfortunate consequence. But to parent based on the fear of losing something is going to have your parenting all over the map. You know, I'd like to think that a judge would sort of think differently. But you know, the idea that like someone can take your own thinking and sharpen it into some sort of weapon and then poke you with it, it's like it's not poke worthy. You know, your plan to like attend a parenting workshop, leave kids alone for an hour and a half, and dump one that's not home someplace else does not seem radical. But you know, if you ended up losing custody, shared custody, I still don't know if it was a bad idea. I'd say the harder thing is that a court is making decisions for your family, not that you made a bad decision. Or that your ex-husband is necessarily evil. You know, sort of like the motivations of people are always so fascinating. So, you know, how do you just hold steady with what makes sense to you? Some of you recall I told a story a couple of times ago here about a mother who I saw who DCF was doing an investigation because she had taken her daughter's cell phone away. Her 14-year-old daughter had called her a bitch, and so she said, "Give me your phone. It's my phone. I pay for it. You're not getting your phone tonight." The daughter called 911. 911 called DCF. Mobile crisis came. And DCF said that actually it bordered on inappropriate parenting. They didn't say it was quite abusive, but they were leaning toward that, saying that because there is no landline and she had no place to reach out in her grief and sadness at being yelled at and having her phone taken away, that her mother cut her off from support. And her mother's comment was, "I was there." That's right. It's like, well, she doesn't like you. It's like, yeah, I'm still here. So the mother is crying in my office saying, "I don't want to go to jail." And I said, "This one's worth going to jail for." I said, "I can see you in the big house." You know, sort of like, you know, what you in for? I took my daughter's cell phone away. Then did you kill her? And it's like, no, just that, just for that night. Yeah. I said, "You'll be on talk shows. You'll be," I said, "this will be like major headlines. Every mother in America, you know, it will be like that breastfeeding incident with Delta. Like mothers will be taking 13-year-old daughters' cell phones away all over the United States in solidarity." And she's like, "No, but I really don't want to go to jail. But I can't like just be afraid all the time that she's going to call DCF." And because this was not her first time calling DCF on her mother. When things don't go well. Isn't that interesting? The timing of when the calls come in. And so I said, "This one's worth going to jail for." She didn't believe me, and she was really worried, and the investigation was fine, and there was no evidence of any inappropriateness found. But it scared her to her core. Yeah. I also sort of said to her, you know, let your daughter experience the foster care system. It's not that fun. You know, I don't know as if foster families are more lenient than your own, especially when they don't know you. Yeah. So, all right, a couple of things before I shut you out of here. November 21st is a workshop at Harwood that I will be doing. So that would be the unfortunate part, is that you would have me again. Parent fears and worries from A to Z, abductions to zombies, how to be a sane parent in an insane time. So that will be 6 to 7:30 at Harwood on the 21st. Also, after the first of the year, probably sometime in January or February, Hannah's House is going to sponsor a master parenting class that I'm going to be facilitating. It will be 3 90-minute meetings every 2 weeks for 6 weeks with a maximum of 8 parents. If you have a two-parent household, I'd love both parents to be there. If it's a single-parent household, one is plenty. But in families where there is shared parenting, it is helpful to have both parents there. This particular master parenting group will be for parents who have kids K to 6. So we're trying to sort of limit the range so we don't have like kindergarten questions and issues with senior and high school questions and issues. And it will be sort of it will be more like, how would I describe it? It will be more like supervision and education than it is sort of, talking head and listening ears. And so it would be sort of for people who want to do some really interesting thinking. You don't have to have a kid issue. Just by nature of having kids, you have issues. So it's sort of like, so that's all you have. You don't just have to have one of them, and you've got automatic admission. You don't have to say like, well, my kids aren't any problems. It's like, good, they don't have to be. But this is a place for you to sort of hone in your thinking about some particular things that might be interesting or curious to you, either about something that has happened, something is currently happening, or something that you foresee happening, and that you want to just be able to sort of get some concentrated focus on it. And the spacing is on purpose in hopes that people would leave each class with some sort of homework to do, and would be able to sort of see over a course of a couple weeks if they've been able to affect some change. And there will be an application process for that, which contact Hannah's house if you are interested in knowing more about the Master Parenting Group. All right? It was wonderful to have you. Grab some fruit and cheese on the way out.